When we think of the Roman Empire, we often think of exactly that, the empire. It's also usually the soldiers of that period that are depicted in movies and series. But before the time of the empire, Rome was a republic for hundreds of years. And this was the period of Rome's most famous generals, Pompey the Great, Marc Antony, and of course, Julius Caesar. And the soldiers back then looked quite different. So in this video, we will shine the spotlight on the arms and armor of the often overlooked soldier of the late Republic, the soldiers of Caesar. We want to take a moment to thank Ancient Warfare magazine. Even before I started reenacting, I was subscribed to Ancient Warfare magazine, and their magazine is the only one in the world that covers warfare in antiquity. And it does so not only in a very in-depth manner, but also while being highly entertaining. So when the chief editor reached out to us for a possible long-term partnership, we were extremely honored and excited. We now have access to their amazing collection of art, and we are allowed to use this in our videos. And because of this, we can truly improve the quality of our videos. Their artwork is created specifically for them, accurate down to the smallest detail, and therefore a perfect match for our desire to bring you the most lively and accurate depiction of ancient history on the entire internet. And since we are taking the time to mention them anyway, we asked them if they could give our viewers a special offer. And they did. So for every self-respecting history buff, go to their website in the link below and make sure to use the discount code Imperium Romanum and get 20% off your subscription. First, we must take a step back and look at what a late Republican legionary exactly is and how it had come to be. In the time of the empire, Rome had a professional army, meaning an army made of men who were trained extensively and who served up to 25 years. But during the Republic, Rome's armies were made up of citizen soldiers, regular citizens with the regular non-military jobs, often farmers. They were called upon in times of need and served in the army for the length of a military campaign, just a few years, after which they returned to their farms. In the 2nd century BC, however, this system proved no longer workable. The extent of Rome's wars had increased dramatically, both in terms of distance away from Rome, but also the length of the military campaigns. Wars no longer took just 1 or 2 years, but could easily keep the soldiers busy for 5 or even 10 years. Moreover, all these newly conquered territories needed to be garrisoned as well. The combination of long campaigns and soldiers being garrisoned in cities and towns afterwards kept them away from home for years on end, not being able to tend to their farms and families, ruining them both. The system of the farmer-soldier came under huge pressure and was no longer feasible. Something had to change. Traditionally, this change from a temporary army to a professional standing army is attributed to Marius, a man who made a name for himself as a general, but got written down in the history books mostly as a great reformer who single-handedly changed the Roman army from a militia into a professional army. However, it is more likely that this change was an ongoing process that did not happen overnight, and neither was the sole invention of a single man. It is true that during this period, the late 2nd and the early 1st century BC, the Roman army changed significantly. Before this period, soldiers were expected to pay for their own equipment, and so the army was made up according to a wealth-based conscription system, where the richest men formed the cavalry and the poorest the slingers and everyone in between the regular infantry. The regular infantry was further divided into 3 groups, the Principes, the Hastati and the Triarii. These formed a 3-layered battle line in order of wealth, hierarchy and veterancy. This wealth-based class system was abolished under Marius's rule. Instead, men from all layers of society were now recruited or conscripted and equipped equally. This also meant there were no longer any different types of infantry, just all similarly equipped legionaries. So, with that out of the way, what did they look like? Going from top to bottom, we're going to start with the helmet. And the first thing that stands out is the plume on top. When comparing Republican soldiers with imperial soldiers,
this is by far the easiest way to know which is which, as all known depictions of Republican soldiers, or at least a lot of known depictions of Republican soldiers, have a plume, whereas for the soldiers of the imperial period, any type of plume is almost exclusively reserved for officers. Although most imperial Roman helmets have clear options for attaching plumes and feathers, it is likely that these were mostly used for parades, as the more realistic in-action depictions of imperial soldiers never show them wearing plumes. Even though there's very few depictions of Republican soldiers to go by, there's also a written source which corroborates the idea that for Republican soldiers it was very common to wear a plume on their helmet. This written source is no one less than Julius Caesar himself, and in his book The Gallic Wars, he writes about his troops being ambushed by a large band of Gallic warriors while on the march, adding that his soldiers did not even have the time to add the plumes to their helmets. So apparently, at least for Caesar soldiers, it was standard practice to add plumes to their helmets before going into battle. And this is definitely not the case in imperial times. The reason for this change is not exactly known, but part of the reason might be that the officers become better recognizable when not everyone around them is also wearing something on their helmet. In Republican times, the function of the plumes was most likely simply being bigger and more impressive and intimidating. As for the helmet itself, for centuries the so-called Montefertino type helmet had been all dominant. Later, in the 1st century BC, with the invasion of Gaul, Rome adopted more Gallic-style helmets as well. And this conquest of Gaul would kickstart the further evolution and diversification of Roman helmets later on. We have an entire video on this topic, so make sure to check it out if you haven't already. In short, the Montefertino helmet and other helmets of this period are rather simple in design, although with clear craftsmanship displayed in the details. The helmets of this era were made almost exclusively of either bronze or brass, as opposed to helmets of the imperial period, when iron became the dominant construction material for helmets. Next up we have the body armor, in this case mail. Although this type of armor is not exclusive to this period, what is special is that this was the only type of armor in use by the Roman army in this period. The famous Roman segmented plate armor would only be invented and come into use around the turn of the century, and even though scale armor was one of the most ancient types of body armor, this type of armor was neither seen in the Roman army until later on, after the successful incorporation of lance in the Middle East by the beginning of the 1st century AD. A typical addition to the mail shirt are, and especially for the time of the Republican era, are the so-called shoulder doublings, an extra layer of mail over the shoulders. Clearly, this added a lot of extra protection around the shoulders. The reason for this must probably be sought in the equipment of the enemy, specifically the large slashing swords of the Gauls, which would often hit a Roman soldier above his shield and on his shoulders. With the transition from an army of conscripted civilians to a standing army of professionals around 100 BC, it is assumed that the equipment became standardized to a large degree as well. The depictions of Republican soldiers do support the idea that all of the late Republican soldiers wore a mail shirt. However unimpressive this type of armor may seem to us, to equip an entire army with this armor was quite a feat for ancient times, as mail armor was particularly expensive. But for good reason, as it's a highly versatile piece of armor that provides excellent protection, much more than Hollywood makes us believe. Speaking of swords, let's take a look at this one. This sword type is called the gladius hispaniensis in Latin, simply meaning Spanish sword. And as the name tells us, it's a sword that comes from the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain. Although the exact origins are quite a bit more vague, but that's a topic for a different video. This sword is very characteristic for the Republican soldier, as it's quite different from that of the imperial troops of the 1st century AD. Mainly, this sword is considerably longer than later variants, ranging roughly between 75 and 85 centimeters, as opposed to 60 to 70 centimeters later on. This might not seem like a big deal, but the difference between 60 centimeters and 85 centimeters is 25 centimeters, being almost half of the short sword of 60 centimeters. So quite a huge difference actually. This also translated to the way of fighting, as these long swords were heavier and clearly had more reach. Therefore, these swords were better suited for slashing attacks, delivering more impact with bigger and higher speeds. The later Roman shorter swords were better suited for stabbing. This sword is about 80 centimeters long, and the hilt is made of both wood and bone. And the hilt is based on the tombstone of Minucius Lorarius, one of the only known depictions of such an artful hilt in the hands of a Roman. Were it not for this tombstone, historians would have had serious doubts whether such a sword could really be Roman, but it truly is. And then finally, there's a last difference to the Roman imperial period here, which isn't so much in the sword itself, but in the way it's carried. Because in Republican times, the gladius was carried from the belt around the waist, while in later times the sword had its own separate belt hung around the shoulder, the balteus. So the next item on our list is the belt, and the Republican belt is also quite different than the imperial one. First of all, it doesn't have the distinctive hanging straps around the groin. It's just a regular belt, but still with some decorative metal plates on it. These plates are a lot less fancy than the ones from the early imperial period, especially when it seems there was a real fashion trend for highly decorative items. And one of such highly decorated items in the early imperial period was the dagger called a pugio, hanging from the belt on the opposite side of the sword. The Republican one though, the one you can see here, was again not as decorated. This dagger was heavily influenced by the Celt-Iberians from current-day Spain. Even more so, until roughly the end of the 1st century BC, this weapon was almost a direct copy from the Celt-Iberians. Characteristic for the so-called Celt-Iberian dagger is the relatively thin and long blade, amongst others. By the end of the 1st century BC, this dagger transformed into something uniquely Roman, with the blade getting considerably broader and leaf-shaped. If you want to know more about the pugio, make sure to check out our separate, dedicated video on this topic. To finish up the ornament of the Republican soldier, he has his spear, called the pilum. And these spears were specifically designed for throwing, although they could be used for stabbing as well. The tip of the spear ends in a long, thin iron shaft, which is often speculated to have been designed to bend on impact so that it couldn't be thrown back. But metallurgic research has not proven any deliberate weaknesses in the shaft at all, which is to be expected if the shaft was indeed designed to bend. Way more convincing is that the purpose for the thin shaft was to pass effortlessly through an enemy shield, so to be able to hit the man behind holding it. This weapon is still in use in imperial times, but with one main difference. Whereas the iron shaft on the Republican version transitions smoothly into the wooden shaft, in the imperial version there's an added rectangle or ball of iron at the end of it for an even heavier impact. They were typically thrown all at once by the entire unit before getting into close combat with an enemy, and it must have been a frightening weapon to face, even before real combat began. So now let's take a look at the shield of the Republican era. This shield differs considerably from that of the imperial era. While both are curved around the wearer, the imperial shield is rectangular in shape, while the Republican shield is more round, almost oval in shape. This oval design was inspired by Celtic shields. Again, the rounded corners allowed for more swinging attacks, where the rectangular corners of the later imperial scutum would obstruct the soldier's movements. Another major difference between the Republican and imperial shield is the distinctive vertical spine on the front of the shield. This spine was made of wood, and it actually isn't a single piece, but two separate pieces separated by the shield's boss in the middle. Their function was probably to make the entire shield a bit more sturdy and durable, and this feature was lost on the imperial shields. A more subtle difference to the legionary shields of the imperial period is that the Republican era shields were considerably taller. One Republican era shield has been found, and it measured 1.28 meters tall compared to 105 meters for a late imperial era shield that has been found. Looking at ancient depictions, we can see that the Republican era shields cover a man from his ankle to his shoulders, while the imperial shields consistently are being depicted as covering much less of a Roman soldier, more likely from the knees to the shoulders. Lastly, there's the tunic and the boots. Both of these don't differ much from those of the imperial era, so we won't go into detail about these. If you're interested in these, better to check our separate videos about those topics. Well, that concludes our overview of the Republican era legionary. All in all, the Republican legionary was an exceptionally well-armed and armored soldier for the time, and and in the hands of a competent general, a real force to be reckoned with. In practical terms, they differ just slightly from their later imperial counterpart, most notably in their longer swords and bigger shields, indicating the possibility of a more solitary or loose fighting style. Other than that, the differences are mostly aesthetical, which goes to show, to the Romans and their circumstances, their soldiers had been perfected. We hope you enjoyed this overview of the equipment of a single soldier, and if so, let us know what other type of soldiers you would like to see us cover. Thank you, and see you next time.